The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. Welcome to Lesson 4, Configuring Validate and Post Form Rules. We'll be introducing you to what form rules are and how they are used and how we configure them using the base ones which are provided by the product itself. At the end of this particular lesson, we will have some basic validation and post form rules which have the ability to check and create person, account, tax roll and obligation entities. Now we are going to look at how the form rules create the different entities needed in the tax form. We are working with an individual income tax form, and the different entities that we need to create are the following. A taxpayer, which is a person entity. After that, we can build an account, and on top of that there is the tax roll based upon a tax type. The tax roll has a filing calendar and has a list of potential filing periods that you can create your filing obligation, and the obligation will be created. Of course, we also have the form type, which directly can define the filing period that is needed. So we're going to have to create form rules which create the particular entities in the right order, so that an account can only be created once you have a taxpayer, and a tax roll can only be created once you have an account and a taxpayer, and so on and so forth. We will also like to create the particular form rules so that if the taxpayer or the account and tax roll already exist, we don't create duplicates. So what we will see is that we will create different form rules at different points within the life cycle of the tax form. If you look at this slide, you'll see the life cycle of the tax form, and the state which the tax form was originally created is in the pending state. And then what happens is that it goes through a validation step. And in the validation step, we're going to check to see whether the different entities, person, account, and so on, are already created. And if they are created, we will actually place the entity IDs onto the tax form. And if they haven't been created, then at the state of posted, the entities will be created. How does that work in terms of the system? Well, let's have a look. If we go to our tax form, the form type, what I've done is created two rule groups, one of them on the posting and one on the validate. On the validate, we have 4 different form rules. First of all, we check to see whether taxpayer exists, and then we determine the filing period. Once we know the filing period, then we can check to see the account and tax roll exist, and then finally we can check for the filing obligation. Let's have a look at each one. Check taxpayer existence is the one that we saw we haven't seen any of these yet. What you see is a main section here. I'm not going to actually manually set them up, but just go through it this way. It has a main section which every particular form rule has, and then it has a details section which is specific to this particular form rule, and we can define where within the form we pick up the ID type. We can create, we pick it up from the section and line shown here, and if it doesn't exist, then we have a default one, and then we can actually check. We're going to check for both the taxpayer based upon the name and the ID type value. And when we do a check on the name, we can use a fuzzy search, and we can do a search based on the first and the last name. Now if there's an error trying to retrieve the taxpayer. Then we have an exception section here which tells you what happens. First of all, it has a category type of exception, and then it tells you in the class, and the class is mainly used in order to tell you which particular state this form will be placed into as a result of the error. In this case, it will be the suspense. And if there is actually an error, what will happen? Do we allow form rules to continue, or do we terminate? And also the priority, the person who's going to deal with this exception, we can set a priority so that reps work on the exceptions in the right order. So this is the first form rule that we would use in order to check. And this particular form rule has all its details, as we know, when we click over here. And then we move on to the determine filing period, which is an important another form rule. We're going to need to know the form rule. The form needs to know what is the filing period that we're going to use. And there are different ways of retrieving the filing period. You can either take the filing period based upon the form type, and in our case, since we're using a filing form type, the actual filing period is directly shown on the form type. So that's the simplest way of getting the filing period. However, you can also get it from the tax type, and if you get it from the tax type, then it becomes more complicated. There are more details, obviously, shown here. And again, if there are errors, then there's an exception section as well. When we go on to the check account and taxpayer and tax roll, then we're going to define what type of account type that you need to have. But this particular check will obviously need to have already information regarding the taxpayer. So if the taxpayer does not exist yet, has not been retrieved on the tax form, then it will just simply not able to find the account, and it will exit. Similarly as well, in order, this particular form rule is used to also check for the tax roll, and the tax roll will need the filing period known. That's why we have the determine filing period earlier. Finally, we also have a check filing obligation form rule, and this particular one will also expect that the account and tax roll and filing period is already existing, and if it doesn't exist, it can't find the filing obligation. If it finds the filing obligation, it retrieves it and puts it onto the form. Okay, so these are the 4 form rules we have on the validate step. If we now go to look at the posting step, we have similar ones, but which in this case don't check, but rather create the particular entity. First of all, we have one called create taxpayer, and this one looks to see whether taxpayer has already been retrieved on the form via the check taxpayer, and if it hasn't, then it will create a new entity, person, based upon the person type, and it has, as we know, address information, and we can pick up things like the title, as we did previously, the prefix. We've seen this particular form rule. And once you have a person, and the person ID is placed upon the form, then the create account form rule can pick up that person ID and create an account based upon the account type and other settings needed to create the account. So again, the account is building on top of the taxpayer. If there is no taxpayer, the account can't be created, then error will be returned. Tax roll here is going to rely upon knowing the filing period, which we already know because we have that on the validate step, and also needs to know the account. So if all this information is determined, then we can proceed and create the tax roll. Again, there are other settings needed if you want to make a more complicated way of working out what the filing period, the tax roll tax roll start date, end date, the default is to use the filing period start date, but if you want to override it by some setting on the actual form, you can do so. Finally, create the filing obligation creates the obligation based upon the known information previously. So the whole concept is that the validate and the posting form rules work hand in hand. The validate ones check to see if they already exist, whether the entities exist. If they do, they are retrieved. And if they're not exist, generally there isn't a problem, because the create step done on the post will do that. Of course, it does depend on a couple of settings on tax type. If you have a particular type of form which expects pre-registration, then you would need to have the person and the account already in tax roll set up, and then in that case you would actually have an error if it can't be retrieved, if the person account tax roll can't be retrieved. But generally the checks existence pick up the existing IDs, entities, if they exist, and if they don't normally cause problems. And then we have the create form rules on the posting step, which if the system has not found, if the validate step has not found the existing entities, then it will create them themselves, and they would expect to have all the chained other entities beforehand in order to create it. If not, there will be an error. So to summarize this, I've just created this particular slide, and you'll see here on the left hand side the list of the validate form rules which are used in order to check for the entities. In the middle, these are the place where, based upon the validate form rules, the particular entity IDs are going to be placed. They're going to be added to the actual tax form, and then they're going to be used throughout. And then on the right hand side under post, we see the different post form rules, and let me just show you how it works. So generally what happens is the check taxpayer form rule simply can check within the system whether the taxpayer already exists based upon the form information, based on the name, first name, last name, ID type, ID value. And then if it finds it, it just simply puts the taxpayer ID onto the form. And then the determined filing period also simply based upon what type of form rule you've created, generally whether we're retrieving this information either from the tax type or from the form type. In our situation, from the form type, if it can find the form type, the tax filing period, it will retrieve it and place the ID onto the tax form directly. Now, the check account form rule, first of all, will check to see whether there is an existing taxpayer on the form, which in fact the check taxpayer was responsible to deal with. And now, if it finds a taxpayer, then it can continue to do a check to see whether there is actually an account. If there is no taxpayer, then it simply can't do anything, because you obviously need a taxpayer to build an account. But let's say you do have a taxpayer, it does retrieve it, you do have a taxpayer on the form, then the system, the form rule can then check the system, see whether there is an account, and if there is an account, update the account with the account ID, the form with the account ID. Similarly as well, the check tax roll expects to have an existing account, and in this case also a filing period, in order to create the tax roll. If either of these things are missing, it can't proceed, and it won't generally error, although look again, as I mentioned, to the pre-registration flag on the tax type. But it won't, if it doesn't find, we'll look up that flag. If it does find it, then it will use the account and filing period, and then check the back system, back end, to see whether there is a tax roll. And if there is a tax roll, it will add the tax roll to the form. Similarly as well, the check obligation will expect to have a filing period, an account, and a tax roll in order to do the check. If it does have those information, it can look up that detail, see if there is an obligation. If there is an obligation, update it on the form. And those are the form rules on the validate. Now, coming on to the post. The post will first of all, the create taxpayer will first of all check to see whether there is an existing taxpayer on the form. If there is one, then the create taxpayer just ends. It doesn't need to do any more processing. It already exists. But if it doesn't exist, then it continues. What does it do? First of all, it simply gets the information from the form and adds a new taxpayer and adds the ID onto the form. Similarly as well, the account checks to see whether the account exists on the form. If it does exist, no need to continue. If it doesn't exist, then it will check to see whether the taxpayer exists on the form, expecting it to have it there. And if it does, then it can create the account. If it doesn't have the taxpayer, it will error. Similarly as well, tax roll see whether the tax roll exists on the form. If it does, no need to continue. If not, it will want to retrieve the account, the filing period, and then create the tax roll and add the tax roll ID on the form. Finally, the create obligation will check to see whether there's existing obligation. If there is no obligation, uses the filing period and tax roll to create the obligation. And that's how it works, how these things work together. So if we now do an actual, we will do a add in use of form to see how this works. So I'm going to go to forms, I go to a tax form, and I'm going to look up my form type, and I'm going to go to my form details. I'm going to add in my Smiles, John Smiles, an ID type, social security number, use sixes. Let's hopefully this does not exist in the system yet, and I save that. At the moment, I'm saving to the pending state. No form rules are running, but now when I hit the validate, the form rules, the four form rules to check to see what exists in the system will run to see whether the person, account, tax roll, obligation exists, and also to determine the filing period. So let's validate. And what do we see? None of the data like person, account, tax roll has been returned, so that means this person did not exist in the system previously. And the only thing that I do return is my filing period, which I expect, because I'm going to use that now when I create the actual person. So when I click post, we'll see that what we have now is a newly created user, newly created taxpayer called John Smiles, who has a person, an account, a tax roll, and an obligation related to that person. So there's four entities which are created here. If I go into the person, you'll see that it's been added. The account exists. And also the tax roll with the obligation also exists for the 2010. Now, if we do this again, let's do another tax form using the same information that we just entered now. Now, our expectation is that the check existence checks that we have on the validate step will retrieve the information in the back end and find this particular taxpayer and all the entities related. So let's see if that works. And then we would hope also that when it goes to post, no new entities will be created because they've already been created. So now if I hit validate, you will see that the person, account, tax or obligation have all been returned to us through the check validation post rules, validation rules. Now when I hit post, my expectation is that it should simply post without doing anything, because each one of the create form rules doesn't do anything if in fact the form already has the ID. So in this case, a person, account, tax or obligation already exists, so therefore post should simply post without doing any more work. No duplicates, nothing like that should be created. And you'll see that actually that nothing has been created, and that's exactly the expectation, and that's to demonstrate to you how the check existence on the validate step and the create entity form rules which are on the posting step work together hand in hand, and in order that you do not create duplicates and the system retrieves already existing entities if they're already being created. So what have we learned in this lesson? We have seen that in order to use a form rule, you need to actually set first of all a form rule group, define a form rule group, and add it into the form type in the rule in the correct rule event. So a form rule doesn't live separately, but must be placed first of all into a form rule group in order to use it. The rule events that you see on the form type correspond to the statuses on the underlying form lifecycle. You also seen that the form rule group references a form type. The reason for that is so that you can create a form rule which actually references sections and lines of the underlying form. So that's the reason why you actually have to reference a form type. The whole purpose of having form rules is such that we do not have to go to the form BO, the underlying form BO, and make BO plugin algorithms. Rather, we can actually create all our functionality for the form on the form type level. Form rules are sometimes difficult to fully understand without looking at the help, and there's inline help which helps you look at the base form rules which come with the system, and it's important to look at those because sometimes they are quite detailed. Also, we have seen that form rules sometimes expect a certain order. One runs after the other. We have seen, for example, that in order to check for obligation, you first of all must have had your check for your tax roll, and the tax roll has had a check for account, and the account must have already had a person. And similarly as well for the create form rules, we had something similar. So therefore, it's very important to understand the correct ordering of the form rules, and again underlies the importance to read the help for each particular form rule about what each one expects.